It was a bright, sunny day in the historic city of Chaverton. The cobbled streets were filled with tourists from all over the world, each eager to explore the famous landmarks that made the city so special. Among them was a young man named Jack, an adventurous traveler who had always dreamed of visiting Chaverton. For weeks, he had been planning his trip, reading travel guides, and getting excited about the famous royal palace and its spectacular guards. Jack had always been the type of person who loved attention and enjoyed pushing the limits. He was confident and a bit impulsive, never one to shy away from doing something out of the ordinary. Today was no different. As he walked through the city, taking in the sights, he spotted the royal palace in the distance. It was an incredible sight. Tall stone walls, towering gates, and grand archways that gave it a sense of mystery and power. And standing guard at the entrance were the royal guards. The royal guards were known for their disciplined presence and stern expressions. They wore traditional uniforms, with shiny black boots and tall, feathered hats. They stood still as statues, watching over the gates with unwavering focus. Tourists loved to take photos with them, and many tried to catch their attention, but the guards never flinched. They remained stoic, as if nothing could distract them from their duty. Jack, however, found the whole scene amusing. He loved the idea of surprising people, especially when they least expected it. He had always thought that a little mischief could add excitement to any day, and this was no different. As he watched the guards, a mischievous thought crossed his mind. What if I could pull off a prank on them? He thought, grinning to himself. In his backpack, Jack had a few firecrackers, something he had picked up at a street market the day before. They were small but powerful, and he knew they would make a loud noise. Without thinking too much about the consequences, Jack decided to use them. He quietly took out one of the firecrackers, making sure no one saw him. With a quick glance to make sure the guards weren't looking directly at him, he lit the fuse and tossed it near the royal guard. The firecracker exploded with a loud bang, sending a puff of smoke into the air. The sound echoed across the square, startling everyone nearby. People screamed and scattered in all directions, and the guards immediately stepped back, startled by the loud noise. Jack, however, couldn't help but laugh. He thought it was all just harmless fun. But as the smoke cleared and people began to realize what had happened, Jack's excitement began to fade. He heard the loud footsteps of security personnel rushing toward him. His heart raced as he looked around, trying to figure out how to escape. For a moment, he thought about running, but then he realized there was nowhere to hide. The authorities were closing in fast. His mind raced as he wondered what he had just done. Was it really worth it? Would he get away with it? His fun little prank had quickly escalated into something much more serious, and Jack had no idea just how much his life was about to change. Jack's heart was racing as the loud bang of the firecracker echoed in his ears. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The crowds of tourists, who had been happily strolling through the square just moments before, scattered in every direction. People screamed, ducked, and ran, unsure of where the noise had come from or what was happening. Some even stumbled over each other in the confusion. Jack couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement. It was exactly what he wanted, a loud, shocking surprise. He turned around to glance at the royal guard, expecting them to be just as startled and caught off guard by his little prank. But to his surprise, the guard stood there unmoving, his expression as cold as ever, even as people around him panicked. The guard didn't flinch, didn't even look in Jack's direction. The firecracker had done its job, but now the real consequences were beginning to unfold. Jack, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness, looked around the square. The tourists who had been so eager to take photos with the guards were now running for cover, their plans completely ruined. The crowd, which had been full of happy chatter moments before, was now a scene of chaos. But Jack wasn't thinking about that. He was focused on the thrill of having caused such a stir. He thought about how he could tell his friends about this when he got back home. I bet they'll be impressed. Jack thought to himself, still smiling. But his happiness was short-lived. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something unsettling. Several security officers had begun to move toward the scene with quick, purposeful steps. Their uniforms were easily recognizable, and their faces showed no hint of confusion. They had seen the explosion and knew exactly where it had come from. Jack's stomach sank as he realized what was happening. The loud noise of the firecracker was not just an annoying disruption, it was serious. The officers began to scan the crowd. Jack quickly tried to blend in, hoping to disappear into the mass of people running in every direction. But the square wasn't that big, and he was still too close to the Royal Guard to go unnoticed. He could hear the sound of footsteps growing closer and closer, and suddenly, he felt like he was in a scene from one of the action movies he loved to watch. He could already feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. A voice called out from behind him. "You there? Stop." Jack froze. His mind raced. He could feel his hands trembling as he realized the gravity of his situation. He had been caught. Turning slowly, he saw one of the security officers walking toward him, a stern look on his face. Jack's smile disappeared instantly. This was not how he had imagined his day would go. He had never thought that his simple, mischievous prank would lead to anything more than a laugh. But now, as the officer reached him, Jack felt a tight knot in his stomach. "Do you realize what you've done?" the officer asked, his voice calm but serious. Jack opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say. How could he explain that it had just been a silly mistake? The officer didn't wait for an answer. "You need to come with us," the officer said, his hand moving to cuff Jack's wrist. The feeling of the cold metal around his skin made Jack realize just how serious this situation was. Jack felt the weight of his decision sink in as he was led away from the square and into the unknown consequences of his thoughtless prank. Jack couldn't believe what was happening. One moment, he was laughing at the excitement he had caused, and the next, he was being marched through the crowded square by a stern security officer. The bright sunlight, which had seemed so welcoming just a few minutes ago, now felt harsh against his skin. The noise of the busy square faded into the background as his thoughts raced, focusing only on a growing sense of dread inside him. The officer's grip on Jack's arm was firm, but not painful. He was being escorted through the crowd like a criminal, and every step he took made him feel more like an outsider. People were staring, some with curious glances, others with disapproval. Jack's stomach twisted into knots as he realized that his reckless prank had caused more trouble than he could ever have imagined. As they reached a small, secure area at the side of the square, Jack was guided into a waiting vehicle. The officer didn't speak to him as they climbed in, and Jack sat there, his mind spinning with questions. What would happen to him now? Would he be fined, or worse, arrested? The more he thought about it, the more nervous he became. When the vehicle began to move, Jack felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He had never meant for things to go this far. It had all seemed like harmless fun. A simple firecracker, a bit of noise to make people laugh. But now he understood just how serious it was. Throwing fireworks at the Royal Guard wasn't a joke. It was a huge breach of tradition, not to mention a public safety risk. And the consequences, he now feared, could be severe. The ride felt endless. The vehicle sped through the busy streets, weaving through traffic and heading towards a part of the city that Jack didn't recognize. He tried to think of what he could say to explain himself, but his mind kept going blank. The officer's silence made it even worse. Jack wanted to speak, to say something, anything that would make this nightmare end. But the officer didn't seem interested in listening to him. When they finally reached the building, Jack was led inside and escorted to a small, stark room. There were no windows, only a table and 2 chairs. It felt cold, almost impersonal, and Jack's nerves shot through the roof. He had been in trouble before. Small things, like being late for class or forgetting a homework assignment. But this was different. This was serious, and there was no going back. The officer told him to sit down and left the room without saying a word. Jack was alone now, his thoughts a jumble of worry and regret. What had he done? How had he let himself get caught up in something so foolish? Minutes turned into what felt like hours. Jack sat there, staring at the door, hoping it would open, and that someone would explain that this was all a misunderstanding, a simple mistake. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. His fun had turned into something much bigger than he ever expected, and now he was about to face the consequences. Jack's pulse quickened as he wondered what would happen next. Would they call his family? Would they send him home with a fine? Or would his life be turned upside down by this one foolish decision? The room felt smaller with each passing second, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he had just changed the course of his life forever. As the minutes ticked by, Jack's nerves grew worse. The silence in the small, windowless room was almost unbearable. He sat on the cold, hard chair, tapping his foot anxiously, his mind racing with thoughts of what would happen next. He couldn't stop thinking about the firecracker, the explosion, and the looks on the faces of the people around him. How had something so small turned into such a huge mess? Jack's thoughts kept spinning in circles. He could almost hear his own heart pounding in his chest. He had acted on impulse, without thinking about the consequences, and now he was paying for it. The room felt like it was getting smaller with each passing second. He wanted to scream, to let out the tension building inside him, but he knew that wouldn't help. Instead, he had to stay calm, at least try to. What would they do to him? Jack couldn't stop wondering. Would they fine him? Would he be kicked out of the country? Or was there something worse waiting for him? He had heard stories about people getting into serious trouble for disrespecting royal traditions, but he had never thought it could happen to him. He had always considered himself a good kid, someone who made small mistakes, but never anything that could cause real harm. This, however, was different. His mistake wasn't small. His mistake had caught the attention of people in power, and now he was facing the consequences. Jack knew he couldn't just sit there forever. He needed answers. But no one had come to speak to him. The officer had left the room without a word, and now he was alone, waiting for what felt like an eternity. He thought about trying to explain himself, to apologize, but what could he say? How could he make someone understand that it was just supposed to be a prank, that he didn't mean any harm? Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and Jack quickly stood up, his heart racing again. A different officer walked in this time, a woman with a calm but serious expression on her face. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him as she sat down across from him at the table. Jack could feel her gaze, steady and unblinking. He wanted to say something, to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. He felt like he was in a movie, trapped in a scene where everything was going wrong. The officer finally spoke. "You understand the gravity of your actions, don't you?" Her voice was firm, but not unkind. Jack nodded, though he wasn't sure if he fully understood. His actions had shocked more than just the royal guards. They had shocked the entire city. He had disrupted something much bigger than himself, and now he was paying the price. The officer continued, "You will be questioned further. Your actions have caused a disturbance, and you must answer for that. But I suggest you think carefully about what you say next." Jack opened his mouth, ready to explain himself, but nothing came out. How could he explain something that, deep down, he knew couldn't be explained away so easily? The officer continued, "You will need to stay here for a while longer. Please remain calm. There will be consequences, but we will handle this properly." As she left the room, Jack sat back down, the weight of her words sinking in. The reality of the situation hit him all over again. This wasn't just a small mistake. This was serious. And no matter how hard he tried to explain himself, it wouldn't change the fact that he had done something that could not be easily forgiven. His life had just taken a dramatic turn, and now all he could do was wait for the next step in this unexpected and terrifying journey. The waiting felt endless. Jack sat in the small, stark room, staring at the door and wondering what would happen next. His mind was overwhelmed with questions, but answers seemed so far away. What could he do now? Could he somehow escape the consequences of his actions? Was there any chance that this whole mess would just blow over? The door opened again, and this time, it wasn't an officer entering the room. It was a man in a suit, holding a phone and speaking to someone on the other end. Jack's heart skipped a beat. The man walked past him without even acknowledging his presence and set the phone down on the table in front of him. It was clear that Jack was not the only one involved in this situation now. He had no idea how big this had become. The man in the suit finally looked at Jack. "You've been making headlines," he said, his voice calm but serious. "There's already media coverage of the incident." Jack blinked, surprised. Headlines. Media coverage. He hadn't even thought about that. He was so caught up in his own panic that he hadn't considered how his actions might be seen by others. He had no idea how quickly news traveled, especially when it came to something as shocking as disrupting a royal event. The man picked up the phone again and began speaking in rapid, serious tones. Jack strained to hear, but the words were a blur. His stomach turned as he realized the full scope of what was happening. The world now knew about his prank, and he was becoming a part of something much bigger than himself. Over the next few hours, Jack was bombarded with questions from officials and journalists. He was moved from one room to another, each place more intimidating than the last. At one point, a group of reporters appeared, asking him questions about the firecracker and his motivations. He couldn't even look them in the eye. What could he say? He had never planned for this kind of attention. He had only wanted to make people laugh, to do something that felt exciting in the moment. But now, he felt like he was in the middle of a storm that he couldn't escape. The media frenzy quickly escalated. As news outlets from around the world shared the story, photos and videos of the incident began to flood social media. People were talking about it everywhere. Some of the posts were critical, calling Jack reckless and irresponsible, while others were more sympathetic, arguing that he hadn't meant any harm. But regardless of what people said, Jack was no longer just a tourist. He was now the face of a story that was capturing the attention of everyone who heard it. His phone, which had been taken from him earlier, was returned, but it was no use. His inbox was filled with messages from family and friends, some worried, others confused. He could see the headlines in his email inbox. Tourist throws firecracker at Royal Guard, and tourist faces serious consequences for disturbing the peace. The weight of it all began to sink in. This wasn't just about a harmless prank anymore. This was a story that was being followed by people all over the world. Jack's life had been thrust into the spotlight, and there was no escaping it. The pressure was mounting, and he began to feel the full impact of his thoughtless decision. As he sat there in the sterile room, surrounded by the buzz of media activity and the relentless questions, Jack couldn't help but wonder if he would ever get his life back. The reality of the situation was slowly sinking in. One impulsive moment had changed everything. And now, he had to figure out how to deal with the consequences. The pressure of the past few hours had taken its toll on Jack. He had been moved from room to room, answering endless questions from officials, reporters, and lawyers. Each time he spoke, he felt like he was digging himself deeper into a hole. No matter how much he tried to explain that it was just a harmless prank, no one seemed to be buying it. His hands were clammy as he sat in yet another cold, sterile room. The walls felt like they were closing in on him. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but none of them could give him the clarity he so desperately needed. He had always been able to talk his way out of trouble in the past, but this was different. This wasn't a small mistake that could be brushed aside. This was a big deal, and he knew it. A door opened, and two officers stepped in. Jack knew they weren't here to give him good news. Their faces were serious, and there was no sign of sympathy in their eyes. One of them, a man with dark hair and a stern look, spoke first. "Your actions today have caused a major disturbance," he said, his voice firm. "Throwing fireworks at the Royal Guard is no laughing matter. You've not only disrespected the royal family, but also disrupted the peace of this entire city. There will be consequences. Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. I didn't mean to. He began, but the officer held up a hand to stop him. Your intentions don't matter at this point, the officer said. The law doesn't care about your reasons. What matters now is what you did. You've broken the law, and you will have to answer for it. Jack felt his stomach drop. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing the words out loud made it feel real in a way that was impossible to ignore. He had made a huge mistake, and now he had to face the consequences. The second officer, a woman with short hair and a calm demeanor, spoke next. We understand that you're sorry for what you did, but that doesn't change the fact that you've caused a disruption in a very serious situation. You've created a situation that's gotten far out of control, and it's no longer just about you. It's about what your actions have meant for the people around you. Jack nodded, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. The reality of what he had done was starting to hit him with full force. He had thought he was being funny, but now he saw how much damage one small mistake could cause. The officers continued to explain the next steps. They would be filing charges against him, and he would likely have to appear in court. He felt like his whole world was crumbling around him. Everything he had planned for his trip, every dream he had of making new memories and having fun, was now overshadowed by this one reckless act. His reputation was in ruins, and he couldn't see a way out. After the officers left, Jack was left alone again. He sat in a quiet room, his mind racing. The punishment was now a reality. He had never imagined that a single moment of impulsivity could turn his life upside down like this. As the weight of the situation continued to press down on him, Jack realized just how serious this was. There was no turning back now. His life had changed in an instant, and all he could do was wait for the consequences to unfold. As the days passed, Jack's world continued to spiral. The small mistake he had made by throwing a firecracker near the Royal Guard had grown into a massive international story. News outlets around the world were covering the incident, and Jack's name was on the front pages of newspapers and online articles everywhere. His photo, caught in the moment of the explosion, was shared across social media millions of times. The reactions were mixed. Some people expressed shock and anger, calling his actions reckless and irresponsible. They criticized him for disrespecting the royal family and disrupting the peace of the city. Others felt sorry for him, arguing that it was a moment of poor judgment and that he didn't deserve such harsh consequences for a simple prank. But despite the differing opinions, Jack realized that he was now a part of something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. His phone never stopped ringing. Messages poured in from friends, family, and even people he didn't know. Some were supportive, offering words of encouragement, while others were harsh and unforgiving. His social media accounts were flooded with comments, some asking how he could do something so foolish, while others expressed their disappointment in him. Jack had never experienced anything like this before. He had always been a private person, happy to live his life without attracting too much attention. But now, he was thrust into the spotlight, and it felt overwhelming. His family had to deal with the fallout too. They had been contacted by reporters who wanted to know more about Jack's actions, and they were constantly being asked for statements. His parents, especially, were worried about how this would affect his future. The pressure from the media was relentless. Every time Jack turned on the TV, there was a news report about him. Articles appeared online, detailing the events of the day, and some even dug into his personal life, trying to find out more about who he was and what had led him to make such a decision. Jack felt like he couldn't escape. His once quiet vacation had turned into a nightmare, and there was no way out. As his story continued to spread, Jack realized that his actions had affected more than just his own life. People from all over the world were now aware of him, and they were forming their own opinions based on what they had seen and heard. His reputation was being built in front of millions of people, and there was nothing he could do to change it. One evening, while he was sitting alone in his room, staring at the endless news reports on his phone, Jack's mind began to race. He felt like his life was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to fix it. The moment of impulsivity, the firecracker, had led to this. What would happen to him now? What would his life look like after this was all over? Would people ever forget what he had done? In that moment, Jack realized just how powerful a single decision could be. A simple choice, made in a moment of excitement, had set off a chain of events that he couldn't control. And as much as he wished he could go back and make a different choice, he knew it was too late for that. The world was watching, and Jack could only wait and see what would happen next. The consequences of his actions were now beyond his control, and he had no choice but to face them. Days turned into weeks, and Jack felt like he was living in a fog. The chaos that had followed his prank seemed to have no end. Each new day brought more news stories, more people talking about him, and more pressure on his shoulders. He couldn't escape the reality of what he had done. The once carefree tourist who had arrived in Chaverton with high hopes of adventure was now a figure of worldwide attention, but not in a way he had ever imagined. At first, he tried to push away the thoughts of the firecracker incident. But every time he saw a headline or received a message from someone, the weight of his actions came crashing back. He couldn't ignore it any longer. His life had changed in ways he couldn't have predicted. He had gone from being a tourist in a foreign country to becoming the center of a storm that seemed never-ending. Jack found himself avoiding social media, turning off his phone, and staying in his hotel room as much as possible. Every time he stepped outside, he was reminded of the story. People whispered as they passed him, some even stopping to take pictures of him, as if he were some kind of celebrity. He felt like a stranger in his own life, unsure of how to move forward. His family was still trying to process everything. His parents had called him several times, offering words of comfort, but even they seemed uncertain about what would happen next. They hadn't prepared for the world to turn against their son. Jack could hear the worry in their voices, and it made him feel even worse. He had never wanted to bring shame or embarrassment to his family, but now it seemed like that's all he had done. It wasn't just the media attention that was weighing on Jack. He had been told that he would face legal consequences for his actions. He had to prepare for a trial, and the thought of being publicly judged filled him with anxiety. Jack had never imagined that a simple mistake could lead to a legal battle. The reality of the situation was starting to sink in. He was in serious trouble, and there was no way to undo what had been done. One evening, after another long day of worrying, Jack went for a walk through the city. The streets of Chaverton, once so full of promise, now felt unfamiliar. He walked past the royal palace, where the guards stood once again, stoic and unmoving. Jack stopped for a moment, looking at them, and realized how much he had underestimated the significance of the place. He had thought he was just having a bit of fun, but now he understood just how important the royal traditions were, not only to the city but to the entire nation. As Jack continued his walk, he realized something important. His life wasn't over, even though it felt like it. Yes, he had made a huge mistake, and yes, there were serious consequences, but he still had the opportunity to learn from it, to grow, and to rebuild his life. The road ahead would be difficult, but Jack knew that he would have to face whatever came next with honesty and responsibility. It was clear now that he couldn't go back to the life he had before, but perhaps, just maybe, he could make a new path forward. The journey wouldn't be easy, but Jack was beginning to understand that this mistake didn't have to define him forever. It was a chapter in his story, but it wouldn't be the entire book. The days that followed felt like a slow march for Jack. The media had moved on to other stories, but the shadow of his mistake still loomed over him. The headlines had faded, but the damage to his reputation remained. Everywhere he went, he felt the weight of what had happened, as if it was a constant reminder of the foolish decision he had made. It wasn't just the court hearings or the legal trouble that kept him up at night. It was the deeper, more lasting effects on his life. Back home, things were no better. His family, though supportive, was still dealing with the fallout. His friends, who had once seen him as adventurous and full of life, had started to distance themselves. Jack could feel the distance growing with every passing day. No one knew how to talk to him about what had happened. Some avoided him, others simply didn't know what to say, and a few were openly disappointed. Jack tried to tell himself that it didn't matter, but deep down, he knew it hurt. It felt like he had let everyone down, especially his family, who had never expected him to find himself in such a mess. The court case dragged on for weeks, adding to the pressure. Jack had hired a lawyer, but every hearing seemed to bring more bad news. It wasn't just about the fine or the punishment anymore. It was about his character, his decisions, and the person he had become in the eyes of the public. Each time he faced the judge, Jack's anxiety grew. The idea of being judged, not just by the court but by the world, was almost more than he could bear. But through all the stress, Jack began to realize something important. His actions had consequences, yes, but he could also take control of how he responded to them. No, he couldn't undo the past, and no, he couldn't change the way people saw him right away. But he could choose to learn from his mistake. He could choose to face his consequences with dignity, even if it felt impossible at times. As Jack spent more time reflecting, he started to understand just how much one small decision could impact a person's life. That firecracker, thrown in a moment of thoughtlessness, had set off a chain of events that reached farther than he could have ever imagined. But it was also a turning point. It had forced him to grow up, to face the fact that actions, no matter how small they seemed at the time, had real consequences. Slowly, Jack began to rebuild his life. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but he started to feel a sense of purpose again. He volunteered at a local community center, doing work that helped people understand the importance of responsibility. He shared his story, explaining how one impulsive decision could change everything. He wanted others to learn from his mistake, so they wouldn't have to go through the same kind of public humiliation. His reputation didn't change instantly, but over time, people began to see him for who he really was, not just the tourist who had made a huge mistake, but a person who was trying to make things right. His journey wasn't perfect, but Jack realized that the unseen price of his mistake wasn't just the public judgment. It was the lessons he had learned along the way. Jack's life had been forever altered by that single moment, but as he moved forward, he understood that the true price wasn't just facing the consequences, it was the person he became because of them.